Oh shit. Wait. Oh, sorry for swearing. I don't know if I'm allowed to
You're fine,
swear.
you're fine. I swear to, even as a Christian.
You know, there's a philosophy name for the basic thrust of your idea. It's called Rose Fawn. The thought experiment is about like a fawn who's like walking through the woods, and then there's a lightning bolt that strikes, and a tree falls on it, and it dies a horrible, slow, agonizing death where it burns. Like identifiable good could come from this. Like it's not like, oh, maybe another animal ate it. Like it's just like unadulterated animal suffering, and just like how to argue something like we're in the best of the possible worlds because God is all good. How do you square that with just like needless?
So we talked about a tree being struck by lightning and it causes a forest fire to burn the animal or something like that. Simply was like maybe the fire cleared out the forest so that like an orphanage could be built on top of it.
The way William Lane Craig responds to this is by pointing out that animals don't suffer in the meaningful sense. Like they have sensation, but their sensation doesn't arise to the perception of a sensation. Like they don't know that they're in pain in that reflective way. So maybe, and he tries to draw analogies where it's like, if you actually took this definition, it would make all these other things very absurd too.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how William Lane Craig does it. But to some people, that's not, acceptable to just basically say animals don't suffer in the meaningful sense.
It's unfavorable, but I wouldn't particularly say it's evil. I guess I would still appeal to the maximally good world. So let's say it's atoms dissipate into the air. One atom goes to foster this particular genome or something like that when someone consumes it, and then this other atom someone breathes in, a whole butterfly effect.
It's the circle of life.
Yeah.
It's so the difficulty with that view is that if you follow it through consistently, you end up thinking that literally everything is necessary. Right? Like it poses like a problem for free will, because like if what you're saying is like that deer, you have to trace every molecule from that deer, which is going to travel along presumably a fixed path, like according to God's will, to its next state. Then like, doesn't that just make the world like a series of like incredibly finite strings, all being moved by God's will?
So yeah, like, at least for me, I don't necessarily point to the world to argue for God's existence, because our typical human response of what we can see with our limited knowledge of what the world is, I don't basically say the world is good, therefore, or necessary, therefore God. I usually take it back to understanding, okay, so why would this God exist? And if he does exist, what does that say about the world? And of course, then that raises the question: how do you know he exists? The resurrection, right?
Well, yeah, like, but do you know what C.S. Lewis said? That was like a killer quote.
I believe in Christianity because
the sun is risen.
Not because the sun is risen, not just because I can see it, but through it, I see everything else.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah. A good quote. Yeah, it's a good quote. Like, it's kind of like a transcendental argument. Like, it's not that you're saying like such and such and such, like evidence here, evidence there, therefore God. You're more going, God, therefore all of this stuff.
Yeah.
And it's one way of going about it. It's not a super convincing way, because it's definitely a way that has more like internal weight. The only thing that people could hope with like a belief structure like that is that like your confidence like exudes to others, and they'll pick up on that, like, ooh, I should think about this God first approach, right? Like, instead of arguing to God, like you're arguing.
There definitely has to be some sort of rational justification in my view. It's argument and therefore God, and then we imply more things about the world after coming to that conclusion rationally that God exists. At least in my view.
Right. I'd love to keep talking. I unfortunately have to go for dinner.
I'll call me winner. Okay. And after a win, what you do? I eat my dinner.
But
yeah, you're fine.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure chatting.
Yeah.
He's saying you'd be kind of like you're just following his orders.
I'm not sure there's necessarily a problem with the relationship between an object and its properties. So take, for example, like a circle is round, but we know something is round because it's like a circle. So then which one is the ground truth, if you will? And I'm not sure if there really is any meaningful answer to that, or even if it's a problem in general. Because, I mean, like, people could just give the brute force answer and say it is what it is. I mean, like, what would we be trying to accomplish with this question, right? Properties, in essence, are what we observe in very like objects instantiated through multiple places. We call them properties because they're the same thing. In this case, with a circle, it's roundness. And we find the same thing in other instantiations of circle-like objects. So I'm not seeing exactly where the question is meaningful. I guess the problem would be when people conflate omnipotence to like defy logic in many ways, but we say that he's maximally omnipotent or
suffering in general. It allows us to ask, is God really good? But then on top of it, I don't really think we can know for sure if God is really good. So it's kind of like a double whammy in my opinion.
What would you do if you have evidence for a supernatural being? Your natural inclination is to think the world is evil, but yet that supernatural being, according to your sources, calls himself good. At least to my answer, my answer is not to go with my feelings, my answer is to go with my head. Because reality, quite frankly, just corresponds to objective truths that are the product of the head. Like, basically mold my morality to correspond with the reality that is presented to me.
Okay, how do you know that God is good?
Because the guy who rose from the dead says he's good.
Couldn't it be the case that if God were evil?
Yeah, it could be the case, but it's unlikely.
Why so?
Older philosophies, they usually conflated potence with benevolence. Because if you think about it, if good is by definition the thing that ought to be ontologically, then you would use all of your potence to work towards that good thing. Especially when we're talking about scales of like resurrecting people from the dead. That usually is indicative of something beyond this world. And if we're talking about otherworldly power, and we're also talking about the capability to be all good, even in spite of what we see with our day-to-day human beings. We're talking about an otherworldly mind, an otherworldly heart, an otherworldly love, an otherworldly compassion. The ancient Greeks conflated purpose with existence, from my understanding. Like, purpose is essentially, if you think about it, what it's going to be, what it is naturally leading toward. And so, if good is that which is, by definition, that which everyone pursues at their deepest down desire, how much more of a desire would that be for an otherworldly being?
What if God's deepest down desire is to do evil?
That's unlikely.
Why?
Everyone naturally wants to do good. Everyone is naturally imperfect, but everyone naturally wants to do good. Everyone's naturally imperfect in the human world, I should say.
What if God made people to be that way?
You have to come to a stopping point when it comes to your responsibilities for your actions. And namely, in this case, it would be God's responsibility for allowing humans to do evil stuff. So say, for example, I give birth to a child and he becomes the next Hitler. That's not my problem, right? Yeah, so there has to be a lot of more agency on my part when it comes to my conscious actions and decisions. And if you're giving someone a totally separate will, then God has quite frankly has no responsibility on what we do.
Okay, but yeah, maybe we're evil, but I'm just trying to focus on God here.
Yeah. Wait, hold up. Wait, so why would God be evil?
I don't know. Maybe he's just, it's just built within him, just somehow. He just is that way.
If a super powerful being does something we usually attribute to evil, wouldn't that kind of mean that it's actually good? Potent beings, if we're talking about otherworldly status, would make their actions fulfill their deepest desires.
Yeah, I mean, by that definition of good, it would be good, but I guess I'm just not defining it that way.
So then the contention becomes what is good, and I think that's where the conversation ends, because for a Christian, God is basically the method of obtaining good, because God is all-knowing. Then we're right back to the question of, does God exist? That's why I typically look at the problem of evil and kind of just brush it off, to be quite frank, because it's answered by God's existence.
Well, let's say God is good, but what God likes to do is torture everybody and lie to everybody and eventually send everyone to hell.
I mean, there are times where there's issues of national security, right? And you do have to lie, right? There are lies that are just straight up useful. So it really depends on what kind of lie, what are you lying about, and how. And usually we're more confident in trustworthy people, because if they're lying less frequently, then they're less likely to lie about issues of worldview implications. When it comes to killing people, taking another person's life, I mean, like, you see where I'm going with this? There are a lot of gray areas, right? We go to war, right? We have to necessarily eliminate one person's existence so that the more virtuous people can flourish. And I don't mean to be arrogant in that, but honestly, like, if some dude wants to hijack a plane and throw it into a building, he ought not to have been born.
Let's say something he's lying about is that in the end he has a paradise planned for his followers. What if in the end he's just not planning that and they're just going to go to hell too?
Well, one, sucks for us. We did our best. We came to the most probable conclusion, and what ended up happening wasn't the most probable conclusion. So, yeah. And two, I would just re-emphasize that's improbable.
Well, my question though would be, we couldn't call that bad because that's God's deepest, downest desire. But my question at that point would be, would you worship that being?
I wouldn't think so. Because it's so distantly removed from what the human essence is. If he's basically trying to destroy the world, is what you're trying to say.
And that's a big if statement, ladies and gentlemen. The biblical perspective has consistently exalted God as the holiest, the greatest of good. Up next, we got some macho Ken Ham wannabe try to use his street knowledge to come to my years of contemplating and research. Being the trained person that I am, and him being the uneducated person he was, I schooled him. It didn't matter if he was a Christian or, quote, on my team. His logic was destructive and needed to be corrected. And with that concludes the second part to my 3-part discussion series on drowning puppies and kittens. Stay tuned.